Some lessons in life come through books and classrooms. Others come through blood, sweat, and the harsh reality of discovering you've picked a fight with the wrong person. For a group of cocky military cadets at Fort Benning in 1987, their education was about to begin in the most humbling way possible. They thought they knew what strength looked like, what courage meant, and what it took to break a man's spirit. They were about to learn they knew absolutely nothing. What happens when entitled young soldiers, drunk, on their own perceived power, decide to target someone they assume is weak and vulnerable? What happens when that someone turns out to be a decorated Marine veteran who survived 3 tours in Vietnam, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and spent more time in combat than these cadets had spent breathing? The answer came swift and merciless, teaching everyone present a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives about respect, honor, and the dangerous game of assumptions. This is the true story of Master Sergeant James Iron Mackenzie, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a warrior's heart, and the night a group of cadets learned why you should never, ever threaten a legend. The Georgia heat pressed down on Fort Benning like a suffocating blanket, even at 8 in the evening. The humidity hung thick in the air, making everything feel sticky and oppressive. It was the kind of heat that made tempers run short and patience wear thin. In the distance, the sounds of military training echoed across the base. The rhythmic chanting of running cadets, the sharp crack of rifle fire from the ranges, and the constant hum of activity that never truly stopped at one of America's premier military training facilities. Master Sergeant James Mackenzie walked slowly along the perimeter road, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, his steel-grey eyes scanning the horizon out of habit rather than necessity. At 53 years old, Mackenzie carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much and said too little about it. His hair had long since turned silver, and deep lines etched his face like a roadmap of battles fought and wars survived. He wasn't a large man by today's standards, 5 feet 10 and a lean 170 pounds, but there was something about his presence that commanded respect without demanding it. Mackenzie had been taking these evening walks for the past 6 months, ever since he'd been assigned to Fort Benning as a senior instructor in the Ranger School. The walks helped him process the day, helped him deal with the ghosts that still visited him in quiet moments. Vietnam had ended more than a decade ago, but for men like Mackenzie, it never truly ended. It lived in the way he instinctively checked his surroundings, in the way he could read a person's intentions from their body language, in the way he sometimes woke up reaching for weapons that weren't there. The evening routine had become sacred to him. It was his time to remember the men who didn't make it home, to reflect on the lessons he was trying to pass on to a new generation of soldiers, and to find some measure of peace in a world that often felt anything but peaceful. Mackenzie believed deeply in the military's mission, in the importance of training young men and women to defend their country. But he also knew that not every person who wore the uniform understood what service really meant. As he rounded a corner near the enlisted men's barracks, Mackenzie could hear voices ahead, young, loud, and full of the kind of arrogance that often preceded a hard lesson. He slowed his pace, not looking for trouble, but not avoiding it either. In his experience, trouble had a way of finding you whether you went looking for it or not. The voices belonged to a group of 6 cadets who had gathered in a small clearing between 2 buildings. Mackenzie recognized the type immediately. They were the ones who had breezed through basic training on natural athleticism and family connections, the ones who confused confidence with competence, and assumed that wearing a uniform made them warriors. They were passing around a bottle of bourbon which was strictly against regulations, and their voices carried the edge of alcohol-fueled bravado. "I'm telling you," one of them was saying, his words slightly slurred, "these old-timers think they're so tough just because they went to some jungle war 20 years ago. Half of them probably never even saw real action." The speaker was Cadet Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 22 years old, and the son of a prominent Georgia senator. Webb stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of movie star good looks that had gotten him out of more trouble than he deserved. He wore his uniform like a costume, all pressed and perfect, but without understanding what it represented. "My dad says most of those Vietnam stories are exaggerated anyway," added Cadet Sergeant Paul Richardson, Webb's closest friend and enabler. Richardson came from old military money. His grandfather had been a general in World War II, his father a colonel in Korea. He carried himself with the entitled air of someone who believed rank was inherited rather than earned. Mackenzie had dealt with their type before. Every class had a few. Young men who saw military service as a stepping stone to political or business careers, who viewed their time in uniform as something to endure rather than embrace. They weren't necessarily bad soldiers, but they lacked the humility that real leadership required. They confused authority with leadership and assumed that fear was the same thing as respect. The group included 4 others. Cadet Corporals David Martinez and Timothy Tank Johnson, both solid soldiers who had unfortunately fallen under Webb's influence. Cadet Private First Class Michael Chen, a quiet kid from California who seemed uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, and Cadet Private Robert Bobby Sullivan, the youngest of the group at 19, who was trying too hard to fit in with the older cadets. As Mackenzie drew closer, he could see them more clearly in the fading light. They had made themselves comfortable in what they probably thought was a secluded spot, but Mackenzie's trained eye immediately catalogued their tactical errors. They had their backs to multiple approach routes, they were bunched together making themselves a single target, and they were making enough noise to be heard from 100 yards away. In a combat situation, they would have been dead before they knew they were under attack. "I bet I could take any 3 of these Vietnam vets at once," Webb was boasting, taking another swig from the bottle. "They're all old and broken down, living in the past because they can't hack it in the real world." Mackenzie paused, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came with controlled anger. He thought about the faces of men he'd served with, men like Corporal Jimmy Santos, who had thrown himself on a grenade to save his squad and whose last words were about his mother. Staff Sergeant Billy Ray Thompson, who had carried wounded soldiers through 2 miles of enemy territory with a bullet in his own spine. Lieutenant Danny Morrison, who was 23 years old when he led a desperate charge to break a North Vietnamese ambush, saving 47 lives and losing his own in the process. These weren't just names to Mackenzie. They were brothers, friends, men who had faced death with courage and dignity while kids like Webb were still learning to tie their shoes. The casual dismissal of their sacrifice, the arrogant assumption that their service meant nothing, cut deeper than any physical wound Mackenzie had ever received.
"You know what I think," Webb continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive.
"I think we should find one of these has-been drill instructors and show him what real soldiers look like. Show him that his time is over and ours is just beginning." The other cadets shifted uncomfortably. Even in their alcohol-influenced state, most of them recognized that Webb was crossing a line. Military tradition demanded respect for those who had served before, especially combat veterans. But Webb was the kind of leader who demanded loyalty through intimidation, and none of them were quite drunk enough or quite brave enough to challenge him directly. Mackenzie made his decision. He could have walked away, could have reported the drinking violation through proper channels, could have let someone else deal with the problem. But sometimes leadership meant confronting bad behavior head-on, regardless of the personal cost. Sometimes it meant standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, even if those people were long dead. He stepped into the clearing, his footsteps silent on the grass. The cadets were so focused on their conversation and their bottle that they didn't notice him until he was less than 10 feet away. When Webb finally looked up and saw the senior instructor standing there, his face went through a range of emotions: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally settling on defiant arrogance. Well, Webb said, slowly getting to his feet. "Look what we have here, boys. It's one of those Vietnam heroes I was just talking about." Mackenzie said nothing, just stood there with his hands still clasped behind his back, his grey eyes moving from face to face, reading each young man like an open book. He could see the fear in Chen's eyes, the uncertainty in Martinez and Johnson, the eagerness to please in young Sullivan, the inherited arrogance in Richardson, and the dangerous combination of alcohol and entitlement in Webb. "You got something to say, old man?" Webb pressed, emboldened by his audience and his liquid courage. "Or are you just going to stand there like a statue?" Mackenzie's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and steady, with just a hint of the Tennessee mountains where he'd grown up. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, Cadet Lieutenant Webb. You seem to have some strong opinions about combat veterans." Webb's eyes narrowed. He knew Mackenzie knew his name, which meant the instructor had been paying attention to his performance in training. That should have been warning enough, but alcohol and arrogance had clouded his judgment beyond recovery. "That's right, Sergeant," Webb said, putting deliberate emphasis on Mackenzie's rank. In the military hierarchy, a master sergeant was technically outranked by even a cadet lieutenant, though the reality of experience and respect told a different story. "I do have opinions, and one of them is that old-timers like you need to step aside and let the real soldiers take over." The other cadets held their breath. Even drunk, they recognized the magnitude of what Webb had just said. Challenging a senior NCO, especially one with Mackenzie's reputation and experience, was career suicide. But Webb was beyond caring about consequences, drunk on his own perceived power and the audience he commanded. Mackenzie nodded slowly, as if considering Webb's words carefully. "I see. And what exactly makes you a real soldier, Cadet Lieutenant?" "I'm young, I'm strong, I'm educated," Webb replied, puffing out his chest. I don't carry around a bunch of emotional baggage from some war that happened before most of us were born. I'm focused on the future, not living in the past. Emotional baggage, Mackenzie repeated, his voice still calm, but with an undertone that made the smarter cadets take a step back. Is that what you call it? Webb didn't recognize the danger signs. He was too drunk, too arrogant, and too sure of his own superiority to read the subtle changes in Mackenzie's posture. The way his breathing had become more controlled, the slight shift in his weight distribution that suggested a man preparing for action. That's exactly what I call it, Webb said, taking a step closer to Mackenzie. You old guys, you're all the same. You think because you went to some jungle 20 years ago and shot at farmers with AK-47s, that makes you tough. Well, I've got news for you. This is 1987, not 1967. The world's moved on, and so has warfare. Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, the evening sounds of the bass seemed to grow louder. The distant sound of a flag being lowered, the echo of marching feet, the call of a drill instructor putting his charges through evening exercises. These were the sounds of military life continuing as it had for generations, the rhythms of discipline and training that had produced the finest fighting force in the world. You're right about one thing, Cadet Lieutenant, Mackenzie finally said. The world has moved on, but some things never change. Honor, duty, respect, the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than yourself. He paused, his grey eyes fixed on Webb's face. Tell me, what have you ever sacrificed for your country? Webb's face flushed red. Whether from anger or embarrassment, it was hard to tell. I'm here, aren't I? I'm training to serve my country just like you did. The only difference is, I won't come back broken and bitter like you old-timers. The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a line drawn in the sand. Mackenzie felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd had moments before combat in Vietnam, when the talking stopped and the real work began. He thought about all the young soldiers he'd trained over the years, most of whom had approached their service with humility and respect. He thought about the men he'd lost in Vietnam, young soldiers who had faced death with courage and dignity. And he thought about what those men would think of this arrogant young cadet who wore the same uniform they had died in. Broken and bitter, Mackenzie repeated, and for the first time there was emotion in his voice. Not anger, but something deeper and more dangerous. Is that what you think, son? Webb must have heard the change in tone, because he hesitated for just a moment, but his pride and his audience wouldn't let him back down now. He had gone too far to retreat with dignity. I think you're a relic, Webb said, his voice rising. I think you're a dinosaur who can't accept that his time is over. I think you're exactly the kind of dead weight that's holding the military back from achieving its full potential. The other cadets watched in horrified fascination as their companion committed what amounted to career suicide. Even Richardson, Webb's closest ally, was beginning to realize that this had gone too far. But none of them were quite brave enough to intervene, to step between their friend and the growing storm they could see building behind Mackenzie's calm exterior. Mackenzie took a slow step forward, and Webb instinctively took a step back, his body's survival instincts finally starting to override his alcohol-addled judgment. But it was too late for wisdom now. The words had been spoken, the challenge issued, and Mackenzie was a man who had never walked away from a challenge in his life. Deadweight, Mackenzie said, his voice now carrying the steel that had commanded respect in the jungles of Southeast Asia. You know, Cadet Lieutenant, I've been wondering what to do about soldiers like you. Young men who think they know everything there is to know about warfare and sacrifice without ever having been tested. Men who mistake arrogance for confidence and assume that talent is the same thing as character. Webb tried to maintain his defiant posture, but something in Mackenzie's eyes was making his knees weak. For the first time since the conversation began, he was beginning to understand that he might have seriously misjudged the situation. Here's what's going to happen, Mackenzie continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying more authority than any shouted command. You're going to learn what it really means to be a soldier. Not the Hollywood version, not the political version, but the real thing. The version that requires you to face your own limitations and overcome them. The version that demands sacrifice and humility and the willingness to put others before yourself. You can't do anything to me, Webb said. But his voice was shaking now. I outrank you. I have connections. My father is Senator Webb. You're just a... Mackenzie moved so fast that none of the cadets saw it coming. One moment he was standing 5 feet away, the next his hand was wrapped around Webb's throat, lifting the larger man onto his toes with seemingly effortless strength. Webb's eyes bulged in shock and sudden terror as he realized that everything he thought he knew about strength and power had just been turned upside down. "Listen very carefully, son," Mackenzie said, his voice still calm despite the violence of his actions. "Because I'm only going to say this once, and your life may depend on you understanding it completely." Webb struggled against Mackenzie's grip, his hands clawing at the iron fingers wrapped around his throat, but he might as well have been fighting against a steel cable. Mackenzie held him there effortlessly, his grey eyes boring into Webb's with an intensity that seemed to strip away every pretense, every layer of arrogance and false confidence. "Your father being a senator means exactly nothing to me," Mackenzie said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Your connections mean nothing. Your rank means nothing. Right now, in this moment, the only thing that matters is whether you're smart enough to learn the lesson I'm about to teach you." He released Webb suddenly, letting the cadet stumble backward and fall to the ground, gasping and rubbing his throat. The other cadets stood frozen, their faces pale in the gathering darkness, suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something far beyond their experience or understanding. Mackenzie looked down at Webb with something that might have been pity. "You want to know what makes a real soldier, Cadet Lieutenant? It's not strength, it's not connections. It's not even courage, though that's part of it. It's the willingness to face the truth about yourself, no matter how ugly that truth might be." Webb struggled to his feet, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to walk away, to salvage what was left of his dignity and retreat. But his pride wouldn't let him. In front of his followers, in front of men he had to lead, he couldn't be seen backing down from what he still thought of as just another old soldier. "You put your hands on me," Webb gasped, his voice hoarse. "You assaulted an officer. I'll have your career for this, you crazy old bastard." Mackenzie nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe you will, son. Maybe you'll run straight to the commanding officer and file a complaint. Maybe you'll call your daddy and have him make some phone calls. Maybe you'll use every connection you have to see me court-martialed and thrown out of the service I've dedicated my life to." He paused, his eyes never leaving Webb's face. "But before you do that, I want you to ask yourself one question. What are you going to tell them happened here tonight?" Webb's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. He could see the trap closing around him but couldn't figure out how to escape it. How could he explain that he had been drinking on base, violating regulations? How could he describe the conversation that led to this confrontation without revealing his own disrespectful comments about combat veterans? How could he justify his actions to superior officers who were themselves combat veterans? "That's right," Mackenzie said, reading the growing panic in Webb's eyes. "You're beginning to understand the problem, aren't you? See, the thing about truth is that it has a way of coming out, no matter how hard you try to bury it. And the truth is that you and your friends here have been drinking alcohol on a military installation, which is a violation of regulations. The truth is that you've been making disrespectful comments about combat veterans, which shows a lack of character. The truth is that you threatened a senior NCO and challenged him to physical confrontation, which demonstrates poor judgment and worse leadership." The other cadets were beginning to understand the full scope of their predicament. They had thought they were just having a private conversation, blowing off steam after a hard week of training. They hadn't realized that their words and actions would have consequences beyond their small group. Now they were facing the possibility of disciplinary action, loss of rank, or even dismissal from the service. "But here's what I'm going to do," Mackenzie continued, his voice taking on a different tone. "I'm going to give you boys a choice. The same kind of choice I had to make many times in Vietnam when faced with young soldiers who thought they knew better than their experienced NCOs. You can take the easy way out. File your complaint. Use your connections, try to destroy my career to save your own pride. Or you can take the hard way, learn the lessons you need to learn and become the kind of soldiers your country needs." Webb wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, tasting blood where he'd bitten his tongue during the confrontation. His mind was racing, trying to calculate the odds, trying to figure out the smart play. Part of him wanted nothing more than to see this arrogant old soldier destroyed, to prove that connections and power still mattered in the modern military. But another part, a smaller but growing part, was beginning to recognize that he had badly underestimated both the situation and the man standing in front of him. "What kind of lessons?" asked Martinez quietly. He was the first of the group to speak since Mackenzie's arrival, and his voice carried a note of genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Mackenzie turned his attention to the young corporal, and Martinez was struck by how different those grey eyes looked when they weren't filled with controlled anger. There was something almost fatherly in Mackenzie's expression, the look of a man who had seen young soldiers make mistakes before and wanted to help them learn from those mistakes rather than be destroyed by them. The kind of lessons you can't learn in a classroom or from a manual, Mackenzie replied. The kind that require you to push past your own limitations and discover what you're really capable of. The kind that teach you the difference between leadership and authority, between confidence and arrogance, between serving your country and serving yourself. And if we choose not to learn these lessons? Richardson asked, his voice much quieter than it had been earlier in the evening. Mackenzie's smile was cold and without humor. Then you'll learn them anyway, but the hard way. The military has a way of teaching difficult students, Cadet Sergeant Richardson. Sometimes those lessons come in training, sometimes they come in combat, and sometimes they come in the form of disciplinary action. But they always come, one way or another. Webb had been listening to this exchange while his mind worked furiously. He was beginning to understand that Mackenzie wasn't just threatening them, he was offering them something. An opportunity to learn, to grow, to become better soldiers. It wasn't the kind of opportunity that came with guarantees or comfort. It was the kind that required sweat and pain, and the willingness to admit that maybe, just maybe, he didn't know as much as he thought he did. What exactly are you proposing? Webb asked, his voice still hoarse but more controlled than before. Mackenzie studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether the young cadet was worth the investment of time and energy. 3 weeks, he said finally. 3 weeks of additional training, conducted during your off-duty hours. 3 weeks of learning what it really means to be a soldier, not just someone who wears the uniform. What kind of training? Sullivan spoke up, the youngest cadet's voice barely above a whisper. The kind they used to do in the old Corps, Mackenzie replied. Physical conditioning that'll push you to your limits and then past them. Tactical exercises that'll teach you to think like a soldier instead of like a college student. Survival training that'll strip away every luxury and convenience you've ever relied on. And most importantly, lessons in military history and tradition that'll help you understand what you're really part of. The cadets looked at each other uncertainly. What Mackenzie was describing sounded like punishment, like the kind of extra training that was typically reserved for disciplinary cases. But there was something in his voice, something in the way he presented it, that made it sound like an opportunity rather than a sentence. And if we complete this training to your satisfaction? Webb asked, his calculating mind already working through the possibilities. Then this conversation never happened, Mackenzie said simply. The drinking violation gets overlooked. The disrespectful comments get forgotten. You get a chance to prove that you're worthy of the uniform you wear and the rank you hold. And if we don't complete it? Chen asked quietly. Mackenzie's expression hardened. Then I write a full report detailing everything that happened here tonight. Every violation, every disrespectful comment, every display of poor judgment and worse character. That report goes to the commanding officer, and you boys can explain to him how you think insulting combat veterans and drinking on base fits with your oath as officers.
The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity.
The cadets were faced with a choice that would determine not just their immediate future, but potentially the entire trajectory of their military careers. They could fight Mackenzie, try to use their connections and their rank to destroy him, but they all knew now that such a fight would likely destroy them as well. Or they could accept his offer, submit to whatever training he had in mind, and hope that they could prove themselves worthy of a second chance. Webb was the first to speak, and his voice carried a note of resignation mixed with determination. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Mackenzie confirmed. When do we start? Martinez asked. Mackenzie looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow night, 0200 hours. Meet me at the obstacle course behind the Ranger training facility. And, gentlemen? He paused, his grey eyes moving from face to face. Come prepared to discover what you're really made of. The next 18 hours passed slowly for the 6 cadets. Word of their encounter with Mackenzie hadn't spread. The Master Sergeant was a man who kept his word, and he had promised that the conversation would remain private as long as they held up their end of the bargain. But each of the young men found himself dealing with the psychological aftermath of the confrontation in his own way. Webb spent most of the day alternating between anger and apprehension. Part of him still wanted to call his father, to use every connection at his disposal to destroy the old soldier who had dared to put hands on him. But another part, a part he was reluctant to acknowledge, was curious about what Mackenzie had to teach them. Webb had coasted through most of his military training on natural athleticism and political connections, but he was smart enough to recognize that there were gaps in his knowledge and experience. Richardson found himself researching Mackenzie's military record, using his family's connections to access personnel files that should have been classified. What he found there made his blood run cold. 2 tours in Vietnam as an enlisted Marine, followed by a 3rd tour as a staff sergeant. 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Silver Star for actions during the Tet Offensive. Commendations for valor, leadership, and tactical expertise. This wasn't just any old soldier. This was a genuine war hero, a man who had faced death and emerged stronger for it. Martinez spent the day thinking about his own motivations for joining the military. He had enlisted because he wanted to serve his country, to be part of something bigger than himself. But somewhere along the way, he had gotten caught up in the social dynamics of military life, trying to fit in with the popular crowd rather than focusing on what really mattered. Webb's influence had been strong, but Martinez was beginning to wonder if that influence had led him away from his original goals. Johnson, despite his nickname Tank, was probably the most introspective of the group. He had grown up in a military family and had always planned to make the service his career, but he had never been tested, never been pushed to discover what he was truly capable of. The prospect of training with a man like Mackenzie was both terrifying and exciting. Chen had barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. He had joined the military to prove to himself and his family that he was capable of more than they expected. But he had also fallen into the trap of following leaders like Webb, men who seemed confident and capable, but who might not have the character to back up their confidence. Sullivan, the youngest of the group, spent the day in a state of nervous excitement. He had idolized military heroes since childhood, and the prospect of training with a real combat veteran was like a dream come true. He was also terrified of failing, of proving that he wasn't worthy of the opportunity he was being given. As 0200 hours approached, the 6 cadets made their way through the dark base toward the obstacle course. The night was clear and cool, with a crescent moon providing just enough light to navigate by. They had all dressed in their standard PT gear, olive drab shorts, grey army t-shirts, and running shoes. None of them knew what to expect from Mackenzie's training, but they had tried to prepare as best they could. The obstacle course was an intimidating sight in the moonlight. It consisted of various barriers, walls, rope climbs, and other challenges designed to test a soldier's physical fitness and mental determination. During normal training hours, it would be bustling with activity as different units put their soldiers through their paces. Now in the pre-dawn darkness, it looked like something from a nightmare. Mackenzie was waiting for them at the starting line, and the cadets were surprised by his appearance. Gone was the neat dress uniform he had worn during their first encounter. Instead, he was dressed in faded camouflage fatigues that looked like they had seen decades of use. His boots were old but perfectly maintained, and he wore a soft cap pulled low over his eyes. In the dim light, he looked less like a military instructor and more like a ghost from some long-forgotten war. "Gentlemen," he said as they approached, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Welcome to your education." The cadets lined up in front of him, suddenly feeling very young and very unprepared. In the light of day, surrounded by other soldiers and the familiar rhythms of military life, they had been able to maintain some confidence about their abilities. Now, facing Mackenzie alone in the darkness, they were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had gotten themselves into. "Before we begin," Mackenzie continued, "I want to make sure you understand what you've signed up for. This isn't going to be like any training you've experienced before. This isn't about following rules or procedures or doing things the way they're written in the manual. This is about discovering who you really are when everything else is stripped away." He began to pace in front of them, his movements fluid and confident despite his age. "You're going to be pushed to your physical limits and beyond. You're going to face challenges that will make you want to quit, to give up, to go back to your comfortable lives where everything is predictable and safe. Some of you probably will quit, and that's fine. It's better to learn your limitations now than to discover them when lives are depending on you." Webb shifted uncomfortably, still struggling with the urge to assert his authority over this old soldier. But something in Mackenzie's voice, something in his presence, made it clear that normal military hierarchy didn't apply here. This was something different, something primal and basic that went to the heart of what it meant to be a warrior. "But if you stick with it," Mackenzie continued, "if you push through the pain and the fear and the doubt, you'll learn things about yourselves that you never knew. You'll discover reserves of strength and courage you didn't know you possessed. You'll understand what it really means to be part of something bigger than yourself." He stopped pacing and faced them directly, his grey eyes reflecting the moonlight. "The first lesson is this. Everything you think you know about being a soldier is wrong. Everything you've learned about leadership, about courage, about what it takes to succeed in combat, throw it all away. We're going to start from scratch, and we're going to build something real." Mackenzie gestured toward the obstacle course. "This course is designed to be completed by a full squad in 15 minutes. Tonight, each of you is going to complete it individually, and you're going to do it in 12 minutes or less. Not because I'm being cruel, but because in combat, the enemy doesn't care about your training schedule or your comfort level. In combat, you either perform or you die. The cadets looked at the course with new eyes, suddenly understanding the true scope of the challenge they faced. Completing the obstacle course in 15 minutes as a team was difficult but achievable. Doing it alone in 12 minutes would require them to push beyond anything they had ever attempted before. "Who's first?" Mackenzie asked. There was a long moment of silence as each cadet wrestled with his own fears and doubts. Finally, Webb stepped forward. Whatever his flaws, cowardice wasn't one of them, and he wasn't going to let his men see him back down from a challenge. "I'll go," he said, his voice steady despite the fear he was feeling. Mackenzie nodded approvingly. "Good, remember, 12 minutes. If you fail to make the time, you start over. You keep going until you succeed or until you quit. There are no participation trophies here, no points for effort. Results are the only thing that matter." Webb took his position at the starting line, his heart pounding in his chest. He had run this course dozens of times before, but never alone and never under this kind of pressure. He looked ahead at the first obstacle, a 6-foot wall that had to be climbed and scaled, and tried to visualize his route through the entire course. "Begin," Mackenzie said quietly. Webb launched himself forward, attacking the first wall with aggressive determination. He hauled himself up and over, dropping to the ground on the other side and immediately sprinting toward the next obstacle. His strategy was to go as fast as possible early on, banking time for the more difficult challenges that lay ahead. The low crawl came next. 50 yards of barbed wire stretched 2 feet above muddy ground. Webb threw himself down and began to worm his way forward, his shoulders and back scraping against the wire, mud covering his uniform and getting in his eyes and mouth. He could hear his breath rasping in his ears, could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, but he forced himself to keep moving. Mackenzie watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable. He was evaluating more than just Webb's physical performance. He was studying the young man's mental approach to the challenge, looking for signs of character and determination that might indicate potential for real leadership. Webb emerged from the low crawl, covered in mud and bleeding from several small cuts, but he didn't pause to assess his injuries. He sprinted toward the rope climb, a 30-foot vertical rope that had to be climbed using only arm and leg strength. This was where many soldiers failed, their upper body strength giving out halfway up. But Webb was in excellent physical condition, and he attacked the rope with fierce determination. Hand over hand, foot after foot, he hauled himself upward, his muscles burning with the effort. At the top, he rang the bell that signified completion of the obstacle and immediately began his descent, sliding down the rope so fast that he burned the skin on his palms. The other cadets watched in fascination and growing apprehension as their leader pushed himself through obstacle after obstacle. Webb was moving faster than they had ever seen him move, driven by something deeper than normal competitive spirit. He was fighting for more than just a good time. He was fighting for respect, for validation, for proof that he was worthy of the uniform he wore. The monkey bars came next, a series of metal bars suspended 8 feet above the ground. Webb's hands were already torn and bleeding from the rope climb, but he gripped the first bar and began to swing across. Halfway through, his grip began to fail, his torn palms unable to maintain their hold on the metal bars. For a moment it looked like he would fall, but he somehow found the strength to continue, completing the obstacle through pure force of will. Mackenzie checked his stopwatch. Webb was making good time, but the most difficult obstacles still lay ahead. The young cadet was pushing himself harder than he ever had before. But Mackenzie had seen many soldiers reach their breaking point during extreme physical challenges. The next few minutes would determine whether Webb had the character to push through when his body wanted to quit. The balance beam was next, a 4-inch wide wooden beam suspended 3 feet above the ground and stretching for 20 yards. It required perfect balance and concentration, qualities that were difficult to maintain when exhausted and under pressure. Webb stepped onto the beam, his body swaying as he fought to maintain his equilibrium. He moved slowly, deliberately, forcing himself to focus despite the fire burning in his lungs and muscles. Halfway across, his foot slipped, and for a heart-stopping moment, it looked like he would fall. But he managed to recover, regaining his balance and continuing forward. The other cadets held their breath as their leader navigated the remaining distance, finally jumping down from the beam with visible relief. The final obstacle was the most challenging, a 12-foot wall with no handholds or footholds, requiring soldiers to help each other up or find another way to scale it. But Webb was alone, with no teammates to provide assistance. He would have to find a way to overcome this barrier through his own strength and ingenuity. Mackenzie watched as Webb studied the wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The young cadet's uniform was torn and muddy, his hands were bleeding, and his face was streaked with sweat and dirt. But there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there at the beginning of the course, a determination that went beyond mere stubbornness, a recognition that this challenge was about more than just physical obstacles. Webb took several steps back from the wall, then sprinted forward and launched himself upward, his hands scrabbling for purchase on the smooth wooden surface. He fell back to the ground, landing hard but immediately getting back to his feet for another attempt. This time he managed to get his hands over the top edge, but his exhausted arms couldn't pull his body weight up and over. "Time," Mackenzie called out. Webb dropped to the ground, his shoulders sagging in defeat. He had failed to complete the course in the required time, and according to Mackenzie's rules, that meant starting over. The prospect of repeating the entire grueling sequence was almost enough to break his spirit completely. "Again," Mackenzie said simply. Webb looked at him in disbelief. "I can barely stand. You want me to do the whole thing over again?" "I want you to succeed," Mackenzie replied. "The question is, how badly do you want it?" Webb stared at the Master Sergeant for a long moment, his mind racing. Every muscle in his body was screaming in protest. Every rational thought was telling him to quit, to walk away, to preserve what was left of his dignity. But something deeper, something that had been awakened during his first attempt at the course, wouldn't let him give up. "Fine," Webb said, walking back to the starting line. "Let's do it again." What followed was one of the most impressive displays of determination any of the cadets had ever witnessed. Webb attacked the course a second time with even greater intensity than before, pushing his battered body beyond its normal limits through sheer force of will. His movements were less graceful than during his first attempt. His technique was rougher, but his determination was absolute. He scaled the 6-foot wall despite legs that felt like rubber. He crawled under the barbed wire despite shoulders that had been scraped raw during his first passage. He climbed the rope despite hands that were torn and bleeding. Each obstacle was a battle against his own limitations, a test of his willingness to continue when everything inside him wanted to stop. The other cadets watched in amazement as their leader pushed himself through challenge after challenge, his face a mask of concentration and pain. They were beginning to understand what Mackenzie had meant about discovering who you really were when everything else was stripped away. This wasn't the arrogant, entitled young officer they had known before. This was someone fighting for something deeper than rank or recognition. When Webb reached the final wall for the second time, he was moving on pure determination. His technique was better this time. He had learned from his previous failure and adjusted his approach. He sprinted toward the wall, planted one foot against its surface, and used his momentum to carry him high enough to grab the top edge. His torn hands screamed in protest as he hauled his body upward, but he refused to let go. With a final surge of effort that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his physical capabilities, Webb pulled himself up and over the wall, tumbling to the ground on the other side. He lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, his body shaking with exhaustion and relief. 11 minutes, 43 seconds, Mackenzie announced. Webb struggled to his feet, barely able to believe what he had accomplished. He had not only completed the course within the required time, he had done it after, already pushing his body to its limits during his first attempt. It was a performance that redefined his understanding of his own capabilities. Mackenzie walked over to where Webb stood swaying on unsteady legs. "That," he said quietly, "is what a real soldier looks like. Not someone who talks about being tough, but someone who proves it when it matters." Jay. The compliment meant more to Webb than any award or commendation he had ever received. It came from a man who had earned the right to judge such things, a veteran who had faced the ultimate test of combat and emerged victorious. For the first time in his military career, Webb felt like he might be worthy of the uniform he wore. "Martinez," Mackenzie called out, "you're next." The young corporal stepped forward, his face pale but determined. He had watched Webb's ordeal with a mixture of admiration and apprehension, knowing that he would soon face the same challenges. But he had also seen something in his leader's performance that gave him hope, proof that it was possible to overcome seemingly impossible odds through determination and courage. Martinez's attempt at the course was different from Webb's. Where the cadet lieutenant had relied on aggressive intensity, Martinez used careful planning and steady persistence. He moved through each obstacle methodically, conserving energy where possible and pushing hard when necessary. His technique was more refined, his movements more economical, but his determination was no less absolute. When he reached the final wall, Martinez had learned from Webb's experience. He studied the obstacle carefully, planning his approach, then executed it with precision. He completed the course with 17 seconds to spare, earning a nod of approval from Mackenzie and relieved grins from his fellow cadets. Richardson followed, his aristocratic background providing no advantage in the face of physical challenges that demanded nothing but personal determination. He struggled more than the others, his privileged upbringing having provided fewer opportunities to test his limits. But he pushed through, driven by a growing understanding that his family name meant nothing here. Only his own efforts would determine his success or failure. Johnson surprised everyone, including himself. Despite his nickname Tank, he had always been more of a gentle giant, preferring to avoid confrontation whenever possible. But when faced with Mackenzie's course, something fierce and determined emerged from within him. He attacked each obstacle with methodical intensity, his large frame actually providing advantages in some challenges while creating difficulties in others. Chen's attempt was poetry in motion. The quiet cadet moved through the course with fluid grace, his smaller stature allowing him to navigate obstacles that challenged the larger men. But more importantly, his performance demonstrated a quiet inner strength that none of his companions had recognized before. He completed the course with time to spare, earning respectful looks from the others. Sullivan was the last to go, and by the time his turn came, the young private was nearly paralyzed with fear. He had watched 5 of his companions push themselves to their absolute limits, and he wasn't sure he possessed the same reserves of determination. But Mackenzie's steady gaze gave him confidence, and he approached the starting line with growing resolve. What Sullivan lacked in size and experience, he made up for in pure heart. His technique was rough, his movements inefficient, but his determination was absolute. He threw himself at each obstacle with the fearless abandon of youth, refusing to be intimidated by challenges that would have seemed impossible just hours before. When Sullivan finally completed the course, collapsing in exhaustion on the far side of the final wall, all 6 cadets had accomplished something they would have thought impossible at the beginning of the evening. They had pushed past their perceived limitations and discovered reserves of strength and determination they hadn't known they possessed. Mackenzie gathered them together as the first hints of dawn began to appear on the horizon. The cadets were battered and exhausted, their uniforms torn and muddy, their bodies pushed to the breaking point. But there was something different in their faces now, a confidence that came from genuine accomplishment rather than assumed superiority. Tonight was just the beginning, Mackenzie told them, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. You've proven that you're capable of more than you thought, that this was just physical conditioning. The real tests are still to come. Webb struggled to his feet, his body protesting every movement. What kind of tests? Mackenzie's smile was enigmatic. The kind that will show you what leadership really means. The kind that will teach you the difference between command authority and earned respect. The kind that will help you understand what you're really fighting for when you put on that uniform. He began to walk away, then turned back to face them one last time. Get some rest, gentlemen. Tomorrow night we begin your education in military history and tradition. You're going to learn about the men who came before you, the sacrifices they made, and the standards they set. And you're going to discover whether you have what it takes to live up to their example. As Mackenzie disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, the 6 cadets helped each other to their feet and began the long walk back to their barracks. They moved slowly, their bodies aching with every step, but there was a new sense of camaraderie among them. They had shared something profound, something that had stripped away the artificial barriers of rank and social status and revealed the men underneath. Webb found himself walking beside Martinez, the 2 of them moving at the same careful pace dictated by their exhausted bodies. That was harder than anything we've ever done, Webb said quietly. Martinez nodded, too tired for extensive conversation, but understanding what his leader meant. They'd been tested in a way that went beyond normal military training, pushed to discover not just their physical limits, but their character limits as well. And somehow, they had all passed. The next 24 hours passed in a haze of soreness and reflection. The cadets went through their normal training routines, attended their scheduled classes, and performed their required duties. But their minds were elsewhere. They were processing what they had experienced, trying to understand how one night could have changed their perspective so dramatically. Webb spent much of the day thinking about his conversation with Mackenzie before the obstacle course. The Master Sergeant had talked about discovering who you really were when everything else was stripped away, and Webb was beginning to understand what that meant. For most of his life, he had defined himself by external things, his family connections, his athletic ability, his rank and position. But during those grueling minutes on the obstacle course, none of those things had mattered. He had been forced to rely on nothing but his own determination and character, and he had discovered reserves he hadn't known he possessed. The experience had also changed how he saw his fellow cadets. Martinez wasn't just another follower. He was a man with his own inner strength and capabilities. Richardson's aristocratic background hadn't helped him on the course, but his determination to succeed despite his struggles had revealed character that Webb hadn't recognized before. Each of them had shown something during that physical trial that went beyond their normal personalities and facades. As the second night of training approached, the cadets found themselves both dreading and anticipating what Mackenzie had planned for them. The physical challenge had been brutal, but it had also been straightforward. Complete the course in the required time or fail. They suspected that whatever came next would be more complex, more psychologically challenging. They met Mackenzie at the same location as before, but this time he had prepared something different. A small campfire burned in a clearing near the obstacle course, and arranged around it were 6 wooden crates that served as makeshift seats. The scene was reminiscent of military encampments from earlier eras, when soldiers gathered around fires to share stories and pass down traditions from one generation to the next. "Sit down, gentlemen," Mackenzie said, gesturing to the crates. "Tonight we're going to talk about history. Not the sanitized version they teach in military schools, but the real thing. The stories of men who faced impossible odds and found ways to overcome them. The accounts of leadership under extreme pressure, the examples of sacrifice and courage that define what it means to wear the uniform." The cadets took their seats around the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. The setting was intimate and informal, completely different from the classroom environments where they usually received instruction. There was something primal about gathering around a fire to hear stories, something that connected them to generations of warriors who had done the same thing throughout human history. Mackenzie began with a story from his own experience in Vietnam, but he didn't glorify it or make himself the hero. Instead, he focused on the lessons learned, the mistakes made, and the prices paid for various decisions. He talked about young lieutenants who had made crucial errors because they thought they knew better than their experienced sergeants. He described situations where split-second decisions had meant the difference between life and death for entire squads. But more importantly, he talked about character under pressure. He described men who had faced their own mortality and found ways to put their soldiers' welfare ahead of their own survival. He told stories of leaders who had earned respect through their actions rather than demanding it through their rank. He painted pictures of courage that went beyond mere physical bravery to encompass moral courage, the willingness to do the right thing even when it was difficult or unpopular. As the night progressed, Mackenzie wove these stories together into a larger narrative about military tradition and the responsibilities that came with leadership. He talked about the chain of sacrifice that connected every current soldier to those who had served before, the debt that each generation owed to the previous one. He explained how military traditions weren't just ceremonial customs but practical wisdom passed down through generations of combat experience. The cadets found themselves drawn into these stories despite their initial skepticism. Webb, who had dismissed combat veterans as living in the past, began to understand that the past contained lessons that were directly relevant to present challenges. Richardson, who had relied on his family's military heritage without truly understanding it, started to grasp the weight of responsibility that came with his inherited legacy. Martinez found himself thinking about leadership in new ways. He had always assumed that leadership meant giving orders and having them obeyed, but Mackenzie's stories suggested something far more complex. True leadership seemed to require understanding people, earning their trust, and being willing to sacrifice for their welfare. It was about serving others rather than being served by them. Johnson discovered that his gentle nature wasn't incompatible with military leadership. Some of Mackenzie's most effective leaders had been men who combined strength with compassion, who could be fierce in battle but caring toward their soldiers. The key was knowing when each approach was appropriate and having the wisdom to choose correctly. Chen realized that his quiet demeanor didn't disqualify him from leadership roles. Many of the most effective leaders Mackenzie described had been men who led by example rather than by charisma, who earned respect through their actions rather than their words. There was room in the military for different types of leadership styles, as long as they were grounded in genuine care for soldiers and mission accomplishment. Sullivan, the youngest of the group, found himself inspired by stories of young soldiers who had risen to meet extraordinary challenges. Age and experience were valuable assets, but they weren't the only qualities that mattered. Sometimes youth and enthusiasm could overcome the disadvantages of inexperience, especially when combined with proper guidance and mentorship. As the fire burned lower and the night grew deeper, Mackenzie's stories became more personal and more challenging. He talked about the moral complexities of combat, the weight of decisions that affected other people's lives, and the psychological toll of leadership under extreme pressure. He described the guilt that many combat veterans carried, not just for things they had done, but for things they had failed to do or should have done differently. The hardest part of being a leader, Mackenzie said, staring into the dying flames, isn't making the big decisions when you have time to think them through. It's making the split-second choices when lives are hanging in the balance and you don't have all the information you need. It's living with the consequences of those choices, both good and bad, for the rest of your life. He looked up at the cadets, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. Every one of you will face moments like that if you stay in the military long enough. Moments when your character will be tested in ways you can't imagine. The question is, what kind of man will you be when that moment comes? The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing each cadet to confront his own uncertainties and fears. They were beginning to understand that military leadership wasn't just about tactics and strategy and following procedures. It was about character development, moral courage, and the willingness to bear responsibility for other people's lives and welfare. Webb found himself thinking about his earlier dismissal of combat veterans as damaged goods living in the past. He was beginning to see that their experiences, painful as they might be, contained wisdom that couldn't be gained any other way. The emotional weight that Mackenzie and others carried wasn't weakness, it was evidence of the moral seriousness with which they had approached their responsibilities. "Tomorrow night," Mackenzie said as the fire burned down to glowing embers, "we're going to put some of these lessons into practice. I'm going to give you a tactical problem to solve, and you're going to have to work together to find a solution. But it won't be like the theoretical exercises you're used to in school. This one will have real consequences for real people." The cadets looked at each other uncertainly. They had expected more physical challenges or additional history lessons. A tactical exercise sounded more familiar, more like the kind of training they were accustomed to. But there was something in Mackenzie's tone that suggested this would be different from anything they had experienced before. "What kind of consequences?" Richardson asked. Mackenzie's smile was enigmatic and slightly troubling. "The kind that will teach you the weight of command decisions, the kind that will show you what it feels like when other people's welfare depends on your judgment. The kind that will help you understand why leadership is both a privilege and a burden." The third night arrived with an unseasonable chill in the air, as if the Georgia weather was reflecting the growing tension among the cadets. They had spent the day speculating about what Mackenzie might have planned for them, but his cryptic comments about real consequences for real people had left them more puzzled than prepared. When they arrived at the designated meeting point, they found Mackenzie waiting with a small group of people they didn't recognize. There were 6 individuals, 3 men and 3 women, ranging in age from early 20s to mid-50s. They were dressed in civilian clothes, but something in their bearing suggested military backgrounds. They stood quietly behind Mackenzie, their faces serious and expectant. "Gentlemen," Mackenzie said as the cadets approached, "I'd like you to meet your squad for tonight's exercise." The cadets looked at each other in confusion. They had expected another solo challenge or perhaps a team exercise among themselves. The presence of these strangers changed the entire dynamic of whatever Mackenzie had planned. "Your mission," Mackenzie continued, "is to escort these 6 civilians to safety through 20 miles of hostile territory. You'll be operating in small unit tactics with limited resources and no backup support. The enemy forces will be played by other instructors and advanced trainees who know these woods better than you do. Your civilians have varying physical capabilities and different personalities that may create challenges for your leadership." He gestured to the group behind him. "Let me introduce your charges. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, age 50-4, retired schoolteacher with a heart condition that limits her physical activity. Mr. Ratzel, James Park, age 26, former college athlete but currently recovering from a leg injury that affects his mobility. Miss Sarah Collins, age 29, marathon runner in excellent physical condition but with a severe phobia of enclosed spaces. Mr. Robert Chen, age 32, computer programmer with no outdoor experience and a tendency toward panic in stressful situations. Mrs. Linda Martinez, age 47, Army veteran with PTSD who may have unpredictable reactions to combat situations. And Mr. David Sullivan, age 20-4, college student with diabetes who requires insulin injections at specific intervals. The complexity of the situation was immediately apparent to the cadets. This wasn't just a simple tactical exercise where they could focus on movement and combat techniques. They would have to manage 6 different personalities with 6 different sets of limitations and needs while navigating through difficult terrain under simulated combat conditions. The exercise begins at 0300 hours and must be completed by 1500 hours, Mackenzie continued. That gives you 12 hours to cover 20 miles while protecting 6 civilians who may not be able to move at optimal speed. The enemy forces will be attempting to capture or eliminate both you and your charges. If any of your civilians are captured or killed, the mission is a failure. Webb felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. This was unlike any training exercise he had ever encountered. The presence of real people with real limitations made everything more complicated and more serious. There would be no do-overs, no second chances if he made the wrong decisions. What are the rules of engagement? Martinez asked, his tactical training kicking in automatically. Standard field exercise protocols, Mackenzie replied. Simunition rounds for weapons, elimination by qualified observers for casualties. But your civilians are not combatants. They cannot be armed or used in tactical roles. They are strictly non-combatants who must be protected and evacuated. Richardson was studying the civilian group, his analytical mind already working on the problem. What information do we have about enemy strength and disposition? Mackenzie's smile was cold. The same amount you'd have in a real emergency evacuation, almost none. You know there are hostile forces in the area, you know your destination, and you know you need to get there alive. Everything else is up to you to figure out. The weight of responsibility was settling on the cadets like a heavy blanket. They were being asked to make life and death decisions for people they had just met, to lead a mixed group through unknown dangers with minimal information and limited resources. It was exactly the kind of challenge that separated real leaders from those who merely held leadership positions. You have 30 minutes to plan your route, assign responsibilities, and brief your civilians, Mackenzie announced. After that, you're on your own until you reach the extraction point or until the exercise is terminated due to mission failure. The cadets huddled together while the civilians waited nearby, trying to absorb the magnitude of their task. Webb found himself automatically assuming command, but he was acutely aware that his previous arrogance and assumptions could prove disastrous in this kind of situation. Okay, he said, spreading a topographical map on the ground. We've got 20 miles to cover in 12 hours with 6 people who have various physical limitations. That's an average of less than 2 miles per hour, which should be manageable even with the slowest members of the group. Unless we get slowed down by enemy contact, Johnson pointed out, or if the terrain is worse than it looks on the map, or if one of the civilians has a medical emergency.
Martinez was studying the map intently.
There are 3 possible routes to the extraction point. The direct route is shortest, but goes through 2 natural choke points where we could be ambushed. The northern route is longer, but offers better concealment. The southern route follows ridgelines that would give us good observation, but leave us exposed to enemy fire. What about the civilians? Chen asked quietly. Mrs. People is today. Henderson has a heart condition, Mr. Park has a leg injury, and Mr. Bear. Sullivan needs insulin injections. We need to factor their needs into our planning. Webb nodded, feeling the weight of command settling on his shoulders in a way he had never experienced before. Every decision he made would affect not just his own welfare, but the welfare of 10 other people. The theoretical leadership principles he had learned in school were suddenly very real and very immediate. Richardson, you take point with Martinez. Johnson and Chen, you take the rear guard. Sullivan and I will manage the civilians in the middle, Webb decided. We'll use the northern route. Better concealment is worth the extra distance given our limited combat power. They spent the remaining time briefing the civilians on basic movement techniques, noise discipline, and emergency procedures. The interaction was eye-opening for the cadets, who had never had to explain military concepts to untrained individuals before. They discovered that what seemed obvious and straightforward to them was completely foreign to people without military backgrounds. Mrs. Henderson was pleasant and cooperative, but clearly apprehensive about the physical demands of the exercise. Mr. Pop was frustrated by his mobility limitations and worried about slowing down the group. Miss Collins was eager to help but visibly anxious about the wooded terrain that would make her feel enclosed and trapped. Mr. Chen immediately began asking detailed questions about the scenario, trying to understand every aspect of the situation in a way that reminded the cadets of their own tendency to overanalyze problems. Mrs. Martinez was quiet and withdrawn, her military background evident in her posture and awareness. But there was a tension in her demeanor that suggested old wounds not fully healed. Mr. Sullivan was probably the most challenging personality. He was energetic and enthusiastic, but completely inexperienced in outdoor activities. His diabetes added a medical complication that could become critical if not properly managed throughout the exercise. As 030 hours approached, Mackenzie gathered the entire group for final instructions. Remember, gentlemen, these people are depending on you to get them to safety. Every decision you make will have consequences not just for yourselves, but for them as well. Leadership isn't about being in charge, It's about being responsible for the welfare of those under your command. The words carried weight that the cadets were only beginning to understand. They had spent years learning about tactics and weapons and military procedures, but they had never fully grasped the human dimension of leadership. Now they were face to face with the reality that their decisions would determine whether 10 people made it through the next 12 hours safely. The exercise began with the group moving out in tactical formation, the civilians positioned in the center of the diamond while the cadets provided security in all directions. The first hour went smoothly, with the group making good time through relatively easy terrain while maintaining good noise discipline and security protocols. But as dawn began to break and the terrain became more challenging, the complexities of the mission started to manifest. Mrs. Devashane. Henderson began showing signs of fatigue much sooner than expected, forcing the group to take more frequent rest breaks. Mr. Investigator. Park's leg injury was causing him more problems than he had initially admitted, slowing the overall pace of movement. The first enemy contact came at 0630 hours, when Richardson spotted movement on a parallel ridgeline. Two opposing force soldiers were moving in an apparent attempt to flank the group's position. Webb had to make split-second decisions about whether to engage the enemy or avoid contact by changing route. He chose to avoid engagement, directing the group into a concealed position while the enemy forces passed. It was a sound tactical decision that preserved the safety of the civilians, but it cost them precious time and forced them off their planned route into more difficult terrain. Miss Collins began showing signs of severe anxiety as the group moved through increasingly dense woods. Her claustrophobia was becoming a real problem, manifesting in rapid breathing, trembling, and an inability to concentrate on instructions. Chen found himself having to stay close to her, providing constant reassurance while trying to maintain his security responsibilities. By 0800 hours, the group was already behind schedule and dealing with multiple challenges. Mr. Chen was asking questions about every decision, undermining group cohesion, and slowing decision-making processes. Mrs. Orphan. Martinez had become increasingly withdrawn and jumpy, clearly struggling with reactions to the simulated combat environment. The real crisis came at 093 hours, when Mr. Sullivan began showing signs of a diabetic emergency. His blood sugar levels were dropping dangerously low, and he needed immediate medical attention that went beyond the scope of the exercise. Webb found himself facing the kind of real-world leadership challenge that no classroom could have prepared him for. "We need to call for medical evacuation," Johnson said, recognizing the seriousness of the situation. "That means mission failure," Richardson pointed out. "We're supposed to get everyone to the extraction point." Webb looked at Sullivan, who was pale and shaking but insisting he could continue. The young cadet was caught between his desire to complete the mission and his responsibility to ensure Sullivan's safety. It was exactly the kind of moral and practical dilemma that Mackenzie had warned them about. "The mission doesn't matter if someone gets seriously hurt," Webb decided. "We call for medical support." But before they could activate emergency procedures, Sullivan's condition stabilized enough for him to administer his own insulin injection. The crisis passed, but it had taken an emotional toll on the entire group and consumed valuable time that they couldn't afford to lose. The next 4 hours were a grueling test of leadership, teamwork, and perseverance. The cadets had to constantly adapt their plans to accommodate the changing needs and capabilities of their civilian charges. They faced multiple enemy contacts that required tactical decisions balancing mission accomplishment with force protection. Webb found himself making decisions he had never imagined having to make. When Mrs. Dean Henderson's heart condition forced another unplanned rest stop, he had to choose between mission timeline and personnel safety. When Miss Collins had a panic attack in a particularly dense section of woods, he had to find ways to calm her down while maintaining security and keeping the group moving. Martinez stepped up in ways that surprised everyone, using his cultural background to communicate more effectively with Mr. Chen and his tactical knowledge to suggest alternatives when the original plan proved unworkable. Richardson's analytical mind proved valuable in reading terrain and predicting enemy movements, but he also learned to balance analysis with decisive action when time was critical. Johnson's gentle nature turned out to be perfect for managing the civilians' emotional needs, while Chen's quiet competence provided steady support in crisis situations. Sullivan, despite his medical challenges, proved to be enthusiastic and adaptable, learning quickly and contributing whatever he could to the group's success. But the real revelation was how much the cadets learned about themselves under the pressure of real responsibility. Webb discovered that true leadership meant serving others rather than commanding them. He found himself constantly thinking about the welfare of his charges, making decisions based on their needs rather than his own preferences or convenience. The group faced their most serious challenge at 1200 hours, when they encountered a major enemy force that couldn't be avoided or outmaneuvered. Webb had to make the decision to engage in combat while protecting 6 non-combatants, a tactical situation that required him to balance competing priorities and accept significant risks. The simulated firefight was intense and chaotic, with the cadets trying to provide security while moving the civilians to safety. Mrs. Beers. Martinez's military background proved valuable as she helped coordinate the movement of the other civilians, but her PTSD symptoms created additional challenges that had to be managed alongside the tactical situation. During the engagement, Mr. Park was wounded by enemy fire, creating a casualty evacuation scenario that tested the group's ability to adapt under extreme pressure. Webb had to reorganize his tactical formation while providing medical care and maintaining security, all while keeping the group moving toward their objective. The final push to the extraction point required every ounce of leadership skill and personal determination the cadets possessed. They were exhausted, behind schedule, dealing with multiple casualties and medical issues, and still facing enemy pursuit. But they had learned to function as a team in ways that their previous training had never taught them. When they finally reached the extraction point at 13:47 hours, just over an hour before the deadline, the cadets were physically and emotionally drained but profoundly changed by the experience. They had successfully completed one of the most challenging exercises of their military careers, but more importantly, they had discovered what it really meant to be responsible for other people's welfare. Mackenzie was waiting for them at the extraction point, along with several other instructors who had been observing and evaluating their performance throughout the exercise. The civilians, who turned out to be volunteer actors with genuine backgrounds similar to their portrayed roles, were debriefed separately to provide feedback on the cadets' leadership and interpersonal skills. "Gather around," Mackenzie said, as the cadets collapsed in exhaustion near the extraction point. "We need to conduct an after-action review while the experience is still fresh in your minds." The debriefing process was unlike any evaluation the cadets had ever experienced. Instead of focusing on tactical techniques or procedural compliance, Mackenzie concentrated on leadership decisions and their consequences. He asked probing questions about why they had made specific choices, how they had balanced competing priorities, and what they had learned about themselves under pressure. "Webb," Mackenzie said, "tell me about your decision to call for medical evacuation when Sullivan was having diabetic problems." Webb thought carefully before answering. "I realized that completing the mission wasn't worth risking someone's life. Even in a training exercise, we have a responsibility to take care of the people under our command." Mackenzie nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. Mission accomplishment is important, but it can never come at the expense of unnecessary risk to personnel welfare. A leader who sacrifices his people for the mission will soon find himself with no one willing to follow him." He turned to Martinez. "You stepped up in ways that impressed your teammates. What did you learn about your own leadership capabilities?" Martinez was quiet for a moment, processing the question. "I learned that leadership isn't always about being in charge. Sometimes it's about supporting whoever is in charge and contributing whatever skills you have to help the team succeed." "Outstanding," Mackenzie said. "True leadership is about serving others, not being served by them. Sometimes that means taking command, sometimes it means following orders, and sometimes it means providing support in whatever way is needed." The debriefing continued for another hour, with Mackenzie systematically analyzing each major decision and helping the cadets understand the leadership principles that had been tested during the exercise. He praised their successes and helped them learn from their mistakes, but most importantly, he helped them understand how the experience had changed their perspective on military leadership. As the session concluded, the cadets found themselves looking at each other with new respect and understanding. They had shared an experience that had pushed them beyond their comfort zones and forced them to discover capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. They had learned to work together as a team rather than as individuals, competing for recognition and advancement. "Tomorrow night is your final challenge," Mackenzie announced. "It will be the most difficult test you've faced, and it will determine whether you've